This morning we are picking back up in the book of Revelation, and we're going to be looking at the seven angels with the seven strikes. This is in Revelation chapter 15, starting in verse 1, and we'll probably get down to chapter 16 and verse 2 as we're looking at this. Now, previously we were looking at the fact that we are, of course, in Scripture, we are in the book of Revelation where we're at, it's describing the time during the mid-tribulation or thereafter. And it talks about the fact that happy are those who die by a Lord. And it's not those who die in the Lord. It's those who die by a Lord. There are people who are going to go into slavery. There are people who are going to die during this time. And of course, the church is in heaven. So it's not talking about the church. It's talking about saints who are here on earth, those who believe during the tribulation period. And then it goes to the reapers and looking at the fact that we have both concepts being kind of expressed there in relation to the reaping of the Gentiles, which is a word that is specifically used more for the reaping of dry grains. And then we also have the reaping of the vines. And in the context, it's pretty clear these are the Jews who are really rebellious and ones who are not believers. They're actually cast into the winepress of God's wrath, which is specifically talking about when Christ returns and he destroys the nations. So we're also going to have some of Israel who is not believers. They're going to be involved with that as we were looking at that. And that, of course, specifically is at the return of Christ when he's going to come back. The angels are going to cast, and not only are the nations again going to be destroyed. Well, destroyed really probably isn't the best way of expressing that, because it really does actually mean to crush them. There'll still be nations in the millennial kingdom, but the bad guys are all going to be crushed, and that's what it's talking about there. Now in chapter 15, we come to the seven angels with the seven strikes. Now, in these last strikes, the burning anger of God is actually completed. So this is in Revelation chapter 15, verse 1, where I said, try that one again. And I discerned another of the same kind of great and marvelous sign in the heaven. 7 angels having 7 strikes, the last, because by them the burning anger of God is brought to completion. So there's a few things to look at. He does actually say that he's seeing a sign again, and he says it's a sign of the same kind of sign. Well, you got to go back to Revelation chapter 12, where he's talking about this sign here that he's seeing in the heavens. So the sign in the heavens, of course, in Revelation chapter 12, and starting in verse 1 here, we have concerning Israel. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Now, of course, when we went over that section, it was very clear that this actually is Israel that's being referred to here. So this sign is a sign that's similar to this one. We also see the dragon in Revelation chapter 12 and verse 3. Then another sign, that would be another of the same kind of sign, appeared in the heaven. And behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems. So this is kind of the focus that he's starting here in the beginning of the chapter in 15. And this sign then would relate to Israel because it's a sign that is of the same kind as the ones he was referring to before or had written about before in Revelation chapter 12. Now, the concept of strike here is kind of interesting because a lot of translations will actually translate this as a plague. But your word strike actually means a public affliction, a blow, or literally a stripe, to strike someone. The man on his way to Jerusalem overtaken by robbers is actually struck by them. He's beaten down by them. Luke chapter 10 and verse 30 talks about this. Jesus replied and said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers, and they stripped him and beat him. Well, your word beat there is the same word being used, to strike him. And they went away, leaving him half dead. Plague or pestilence is actually a different word. So if it was saying that they have the 7 last plagues, it would actually use a completely different word. And we see that word being used over in Luke chapter 21 and verse 11. And here it says, and there will be great earthquakes and in various places plagues and famines. And it actually does use your proper word for plague there. It doesn't use the word for strike like we have over here in Revelation chapter 15. We also have it used with Paul, where he was actually beaten. Second Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 5 talks about this. Now he says, in beatings, in imprisonment, in tumults, in labor, in sleeplessness, in hunger, as he's giving this list. Well, the first one, in beatings, is that, again, that same word to be for somebody to strike you. He was actually beaten. The only place actually this is translated as plague is in the book of Revelation, which of course brings up some question, because it's like, well, if you're going to change the meaning of a word, well, that's not really appropriate in the translations. So he's not talking about plagues that are going to come upon mankind at this point. He's talking about these 7 strikes that are going to come upon, well, really, those who are actually, well, more specifically, as we go through this, it'll be those who follow the beast. Now, the word strike has been used previously in the book. So it's not like every occurrence of it is actually translated as plague. The wound to the beast, Revelation chapter 13 and verse 3. And one out from his head as wounded unto death. Well, that wound was a strike unto death, same word that were being used here. And his wound unto death was healed, and the whole world wondered after the beast. So they do actually know the meaning of it. They've just kind of modified it, and then we get the idea of these plagues. Now, I do kind of understand where conceptually they're going and looking at what is the content of these 7, but really it's talking about these strikes that are coming against the unbelieving men. These 7 strikes are the last, but they are not last in order. That is, it's not the last 7 strikes, because that would imply that there were previous strikes before this. Well, there are no previous strikes before this. This is specifically saying these 7 strikes, they're the last. They're last in order, in the sense of they are going to be the last in relation to what's going on during the tribulation period. And when they are finished, the wrath of God is going to be completed. So it would be better to actually translate this here, saying 7 angels having 7 strikes, the last. It's a little stilted, but it's not saying the last 7 strikes. It's saying these are the last ones. They are referred to as the last because they will complete the burning anger of God. That will be completed when they are actually done. So this burning anger of God, which involves, of course, ultimately his wrath, because God's wrath is expressed, it is the outward manifestation of his inward burning anger against unrighteousness. We actually see God's wrath being expressed today, but God's wrath, by the way, is only something that is actually expressed upon those who are alive. After you die, God's wrath is not actually expressed, or it's not, you don't see God's wrath upon a person who has died. You see judgment, which is different, completely different. But those who are alive, God actually does express his wrath upon them. And over in Romans chapter 1 and verse 18, we see God's inner burning anger. When it's expressed, it is wrath. And Romans 1:18 says, for God's wrath is manifested from heaven upon all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, the ones holding down the truth in unrighteousness. Now, how is God's wrath actually manifested today? It's manifested because he's going to allow them to continue, that is, those who reject him, he's going to allow them to continue down the path they're going, and he's not going to hinder them. You know, now at first you would think, oh, well, that means they're getting away with everything, but actually they're not, because in the end, they are going to be judged for their works. And along with that, as they continue to reject the truth from God, He allows them to be turned over to a mind that is corrupt, that does not produce anything that is good, so that then the conclusions of their thought patterns are completely wrong. And they begin to really pervert themselves even more among themselves and continue to manifest the works of the flesh, because in the end, they will face judgment for their works. And when they're facing judgment for their works, they will pay in full for it. God is not actually permitting, he's not getting involved with that. Now, this is a quality of God's wrath that's shown today. It's not the same as the wrath that's going to be in the tribulation period, but you still see a manifestation of that wrath that's going to come out during that wrath that God has. However, during the tribulation period, once these 7 strikes are done, the burning anger of God is complete. That's it. It's over. It's done. We're not going to see that anger being manifested again at some other time, because he's completed it. Now, his wrath being finished does not mean that judgment is done, because judgment is actually different than wrath. It's not the same thing. Now, he can be wrathful and judge, but wrath, he is paying back unsaved mankind for exactly what they deserve, as he's going to crush them. Judgment is actually something that is done in righteousness. It's not done in wrath. Revelation chapter 19 and verse 11, and I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and wages war. So you see, it's not in wrath that he's doing this, but it's in righteousness that he's actually doing this. In righteousness, he is waging war and judging. So completely different concept there. We also see over in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 23 that he is the one who judges righteously. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threat, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. So the judgment is still going to be completed. That is, after the wrath of God is poured out and we have the end of the tribulation period, we're going to be going into the millennial kingdom. No more wrath from God is going to be expressed. That burning anger that he has is going to be completely finished. However, judgment is still coming, because judgment the completion of judgment happens at the great white throne. Revelation chapter 20 and verse 11. Then I saw a great white throne and him who sat upon it, from whose presence earth and heaven fled away, and no place was found for them. Now, of course, when we get into the context, we'll get into some more detail there on that, because the great white throne of judgment is a judgment for all unsaved, and it is judging their works. It's not judging their sins, it's judging their works. And that judgment, that payment for their works, is going to come back upon them, and they're going to pay for it for all eternity. Simple as that. That's judgment. That's not done in wrath. There's no manifestation of wrath during the great white throne. That wrath has already been completed. Now, we go on in Revelation chapter 15 to those who have overcome the beast. And this is in Revelation chapter 15, verses 2 through 4. We first see this sea of glass mixed with fire over in Revelation chapter 5 and verse 2. And here it says, and I saw something like a sea of glass mixed with fire, and those who have been victorious over the beast and his image and the number of his name, standing on the sea of glass, holding harps from God. Now, this is giving us an indication that it is in the third heaven. So it's still during the tribulation period at this point, and we have these who are up in the third heaven, and they are standing on this sea of glass, which is actually a representation of, well, really, I should say, the temple. You go back to the temple on earth, it was a shadow of the things in heaven. It was a copy, an image, and a shadow of those things. So here we actually have a representation where the wash basin that was in the temple here on earth is being represented. Well, it was a representation of what really was in the heavens that is no longer needed, because that Because of Christ's sacrifice. Now, because of Christ's sacrifice, we see it like a sea of glass. So there is no longer this requirement to come and to be washed prior to entering in the presence of God. Because Christ's blood not only deals with our sins, it also deals with all sins. He is a propitiatory for all sin. A propitiation does not mean that he's saving everybody. It means that God can be righteous in dealing with sinful creatures. Now in Exodus 30:18, we see that wash basin or the laver. You shall also make a laver of bronze, with it a brass, with its base of bronze for washing, and you shall put it between the tent of the meeting and the altar, and you shall put water in it there. The ones standing on the sea, they are ones who have overcome the beast and his image. So again, that puts us in the second half of the tribulation period, because the beast does not rise in this way until the second half. That is, in the second half, the beast is actually going to set himself up as king. He's going to have an image, well, more specifically, the false prophet is going to have an image made of the beast. This image is going to be given a spirit. I know some translations say a breath, but when we're going over that, it's more than just it can breathe. It can actually communicate in a way where it will cause those who refuse to worship it to be put to death. So these are the ones who have overcome the beast. Of course, which would indicate that they were killed by the beast in the image. They refused to actually worship the beast and worship the image of it. In Revelation chapter 13 and verse 15. And it was given to the Spirit to give to the image of the beast, in order that also it should speak, the image of the beast. And it made as many as if perhaps did not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Like I said over in Revelation chapter 13, verse 15, it's not really breath in the sense that it's breathing. It's more of a spirit. It has this appearance of intelligence in the way that it's communicating, and it has to be able to communicate in a way to indicate those who don't worship it will actually be put to death. They refused to worship him, and they overcame the mark of the beast. So they're not taking the mark of the beast. And you see this in Revelation chapter 13, verses 16 through 17. And it made all, the small and the great, and the rich and the poor, and the free and the slave, in order that they should give to them a mark upon their right hand or upon their forehead, in order that someone should not have the ability to buy or to sell except the ones having the mark, the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Of course, when we were going over that, we were looking at the fact, and this is well known, the mark of the beast. There's unfortunately a lot of bad information out there about this, but the main thing to remember in relation to the mark of the beast is, number one, it is an actual physical mark. It's very clear the way Scripture describes it. And number two, it does not happen until the second half of the tribulation period, which means we will not see the mark of the beast today. We cannot see the mark of the beast because the man of lawlessness has not been revealed, and the mark of the beast is the mark of his name. So this is for mid-tribulation and thereafter, and these are the ones who refused to actually accept it. Now that basically meant they could not be in the primary area where commerce was actually happening. They could not go into just the general shops and purchase things because they didn't have the mark. They refused to be involved with that. Now they sing the song of Moses in Revelation chapter 15 and verse 3. And I think the indication here in singing the song of Moses, as it says here, and they sang the song of Moses, the bondservant of God, does indicate that these are actually Jews. These are Jews who were put to death because they refused to submit to the beast. Now, the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 1 through 43, describes a time where Satan, or well, Israel actually is where the ones that are going to be impacted by this, where Israel is in their rebellion, is going to cause some major issues but God is ultimately going to restore them. Moses starts out with worshiping God, and you see this in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 1 through 4. And I'm not going to read this whole entire song because it is a rather long song, but it's worth the time to take to actually read it and understand it, because within it he does give some very specific details in relation to not only what is going to happen to Israel in rebellion, but the fact that the man of lawlessness is going to come, that the church is actually going to be present. Now, it doesn't call it the church. What it says is, I will make you jealous from a people who are not. And we understand now, after the revelation that we have in the New Testament, that is, he's referring to the church. And then ultimately the full restoration of Israel. So even in Moses' song, he's calling this stuff out. So he starts out with worship. He then goes on to calling out the nation for its perversity in Deuteronomy 32, 5 through 6. And then he calls to remember what God has done. Now, this is a reminder to Israel, and this song was given to Israel to remind them of what God has actually done and what he will ultimately do. It's going to inform of that. Deuteronomy 32, 7 through 14 is where he's talking about that, for them to remember what God has done. And then in 15 through 18, he talks about the fact that Israel is forsaking God. And he knew that they were going to forsake God. He even calls them out before writing the song out, saying, you know, in the previous chapter, that is, he's basically saying, you all are rebellious while I'm here. How bad is it going to be when I'm gone? And he writes this song as a remembrance to them. And then he goes on to talk about the Lord's response to their sin in verses 19 through 35, where they will be punished for their sin, but ultimately God will actually provoke them to jealousy to follow him. And that's in verse 21. He will provoke them to jealousy for their God by a people who are not a people. And that would be us of the church. He actually provoked them to follow him. His anger will consume the earth. In 22 through 25, of course, that is specifically, or more information is given about exactly how it's going to consume the earth in the book of Revelation. You know, along with some of the other ones, you know, we have the prophets also gave some of this information, but we get a lot more detail about it in the book of Revelation. He would have destroyed them if not for their enemy, because their enemy would have said, well, he just brought them out to kill them. That's how rebellious Israel was. Remember, God told Moses, I will destroy them and I will raise a nation up from your seed. And Moses said, no, no, no. That would not look good among the nations, because Moses understood what God was doing. And that's in verse 26 and 27. Israel is a nation that lacks wisdom and understanding. You know, they were brought out miraculously from Egypt. They stood before God on the mountain. They heard him. They didn't want to hear him. They covered their ears. He said, guard my covenant. And what was their response? Wasn't very wise. They said, you just keep on telling us what to do and we'll do it. So God gave them the law. They're a nation that lacks wisdom and understanding. And this is in 28 and 29. However, the Lord will vindicate his people. He will purge them of the unbelievers, and he will give them exactly what he promised he would. Verses 36 through 43, he describes that. So these ones here in Revelation chapter 15 that we're talking about, they are ones who would be saved by the believing the message of the 144,000. Because remember, as the mid-tribulation comes about, 144,000 Jews are actually sealed, and they're sent throughout the whole entire world. So it would involve their ministry. And you can see this because they not only sing the song of Moses, they actually sing the song of the Lamb. And so we have really salvation in relation to Christ's death and resurrection. Revelation chapter 15, verse 3, and the song of the Lamb sang. So they not only sung the song of Moses, but also the song of the Lamb, showing that they actually understood that there was victory through the blood of the Lamb. That is, these Jews would be believing in the Messiah, that Jesus is the Messiah. They would be believing what the 144,000 are bringing. They will sing of their salvation by Christ's sacrifice and resurrection. That song of the Lamb. Then it goes on in Revelation chapter 15, verses 3 through 4 to talk about worshiping God. And this is what they're going to do in how they're actually singing. Great and marvelous are your works, Lord. The God, the omnipotent, righteous, and true are your ways. The King of the Gentiles. Now, you could say nations here, but it's normally your word for Gentiles. So I'm translating it as Gentiles to understand the focus here. Because even in the song of Moses, it talks about the fact that he will actually bring the Gentiles, he will crush the nations. Who will never fear you, Lord, and express a proper opinion of your name. And that's really important, there. The question is, who is a created being will never fear God? Well, there is no one who will never fear God. Because only holy, that is, only you are holy. Because all the Gentiles will come and worship before you because your righteous works have been revealed. And of course, you go back to the Old Testament where it's talking about the fact that the nations will come and worship him. So they're recognizing what God has done and worshiping him. They're acknowledging his works, giving him credit for what he has actually done. They're acknowledging his power. He's the one that truly has power. There is no one else. Well, as a matter of fact, there's no one, like I said, that will not fear him. And also will not express a proper opinion of who he is. They acknowledge his righteous and true ways. And they're seeing that. They see that what he is doing, now it's during the tribulation period. We have this wrath being poured out upon the earth. We have the man of lawlessness who is trying to reign at this point, yet they can see that God's ways are righteous and true. They recognize his rule of the Gentiles. Now, this would be a focus on the Lamb, not on God the Father. This would be a focus on the Lamb. They're recognizing his rule of the nations. All will fear him, for there is none that will not fear him. Now, in the end, Scripture very clearly says that every knee will bow before Christ and they will confess. They will give a proper opinion of who he is. Every knee. All the Gentiles will come and worship him, and during the millennial kingdom, that's exactly what's going to happen. The Gentiles are going to go to Jerusalem to worship God. So now the 7 angels are then given 7 bowls. This is in Revelation chapter 15, verses 5 through 8. Now here it talks about the fact it's going to start out with the Holy of Holies being opened in Revelation chapter 15 and verse 5. And after these things I discerned in the Holy of Holies of the tabernacle of the testimony, and the heaven was opened. And it is in, of course, the heaven. So it would be, again, putting us back into the third heaven and what's going on in the third heaven at this time. Now, by the way, the beginning of this chapter kind of gives us a really quick summary of some of the things that are going to happen as we go on. So it's kind of like a quick summary, and then he gets into a little bit more detail. So now we're in the third heaven. The curtain or covering to the Holy of Holies is actually opened. And the 7 angels with the 7 strikes we now see. In verse 6, and the 7 angels came out, having the 7 strikes out from the Holy of Holies. These ones are dressed in garments clean and bright, and have girt around their chests belts of gold. One of the 4 of the cherubim, these would be the 4 of the cherubim that are before the throne with us, the church, sitting upon the throne there, the 24 elders. So one of the 4 cherubim that's there, the one before the throne, gives the angels 7 bowls, which deals with these actual strikes. And one out from the four living creatures gave to the seven angels 7 golden bowls, being full of burning anger of the living God into the ages of the ages. Revelation chapter 15 and verse 7. So we see these particular bowls are actually ones who are full of the burning anger of God, that inner burning anger. Now, of course, when it's poured out, we're going to then see it as wrath. But right now, it's that burning anger of God. Now the Holy of Holies is going to be filled with smoke. Revelation chapter 15 and verse 8. And the Holy of Holies was filled with smoke out from the glory of God and out from his inherent ability. And no one had the ability to enter into the Holy of Holies until the 7 strikes of the 7 angels were finished. Now, no one is able to enter in. You got to follow what's going on in the context here, because we have people who are actually on this sea of glass and they're worshiping God. These are human beings. The no one, when you take it back into the context and understand, because remember, it's kind of the same as the word all. All does not mean all things in all times. It means all in relation to the context. So no one is able to enter into the Holy of Holies. You got to go back into the context and understand who is the no one. And this goes back to the angels, actually. No more angels are going to be entering into the Holy of Holies. Not during this time, because they have these 7 strikes, which are the last. So there's no reason for them to enter in at this point. The 7 angels have already received the 7 bowls, and therefore they are ready. And these bowls, of course, are going to finish the inner burning anger of God. You know, and we have seen already multiple times where the angels have come with trumpets and other things, and this is the last of what is going to happen. So that's when it says no one can enter in. That's what it's actually talking about. It's not a restriction to no created being can enter in. It's in the context. It's saying those angels. There's no more angels coming in and out of there. There's no more judgment that's going to, or wrath, more specifically, I should say, in this sense. No more wrath is going to be poured out upon the earth once these are done. Those who are victorious over the beast, of course, they were just described as being in the temple, and they're there still. So it's not restricted. It's not restricting their movement in that. And then we come to Revelation chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, where we come to the first strike here. So in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 2, or 1 and 2, the angels are going to be, in verse 1 specifically, the angels are going to be instructed to pour out the bowls upon the earth. So Revelation chapter 16 and verse 1 says, "And I heard a great voice out from the Holy of Holies saying to the 7 angels, go and pour out the 7 bowls of the burning anger of God onto the earth." I know some translations actually say wrath, but it's not the right word for wrath. It is actually your word that means the burning anger. And I think that's important to make distinctions to that, because especially in understanding the concept between wrath and anger, you know, it's like for us as Christians, we can be angry, but we are not to sin in our anger. Yet our wrath, which is a manifestation of our anger, does not work out the righteousness of God. So we have to be cautious with that. So there is a difference between them. So we have here the burning anger of God because it hasn't been poured out yet. In Revelation 2, we then have, "And the first came and poured out his bowl on the earth, and there came to be bad and malignant sores upon the humans, the one having the mark of the beast and the one worshiping his image." Now, this is important to pay attention to here because it limits who is going to be impacted by this bowl that is being poured out upon the earth. And as a matter of fact, because it's starting out with this limit, by limiting them to the mark, those who have the mark of the beast and who worship his image, it is all the rest of them are going to impact them also, unless they say otherwise. That's something to pay attention to. It's specifically focusing on those who are going to follow the beast. They're going to have this bowl poured out upon them, that is this manifestation of God's inner burning anger for what they're doing. The content of the bowl then will impact those who worship the image of the beast, along with those who take his image. It's actually kind of interesting when you look at the two, it is describing them differently. That is, it's describing two groups of people. So one who gets the mark may not necessarily be one who worships, and one who worships may not be necessarily one who gets the mark. Now, of course, in most cases, you would indicate they would have both, but the way Scripture actually describes it, they are two different people groups. It's not those who got the mark and those who worship. These sores are going to lack in character. It talks about them being bad sores, but they actually uses the word lacking in character. That is, they're not a normal sore. There's something really bad about these, and they react differently than what you would expect. That's really what it's using when it says that they're lacking in character. It's like, in most cases with some of the sores, and whether it's an ulcer or something else that we get on our skin, we have certain things that we can do to actually alleviate the pain or to deal with ultimately taking care of it. These sores aren't going to do what you would normally expect them to do. So they may look similar to other sores, but they're going to react in a different way. They're going to react in a way that really lacks character for what kind of sores they are. They're sores also that spread. So not only do they lack in character, so you look at it as to where they are a lesion in the skin that you would expect to do a certain thing, but they're doing something completely different. And now we also have them actually spreading. Now they're malignant. It also describes them in that way. So they're going to be able to transmit through contact from person to person, and probably upon the body too. For a normal lesion, if you scratch it, it wouldn't necessarily transfer to the rest of the body. Now, we do have some diseases that would do that, but it's very clearly in the way that it's describing this would be the type of a lesion upon the skin that wouldn't normally transfer around, but yet these are. And they're going to be very malignant, which means they're not only going to go from person to person, but on the same person, they're going to spread. And it's going to be really, very terrible little sores that they're going to actually get. No, these are not sores because they got some device installed in them and the radio waves and the radiation is impacting them. That's not the way that this is being described. These are specific sores that are poured out as a result of, and they come upon them as a result of the wrath of God being poured out upon them. And they're very specific, and this is for the ones that, only the ones who took the mark of the beast and worship his image. It's very limited to those. So it's not every single human being on earth that's going to get these. So we look at what's going on here in this 15th chapter. We have the 7 angels with the 7 last strikes, and that is these 7 strikes, not really plagues. Now again, you see the first bowl, and the first bowl is the sores, and you think of it as plagues, but this is actually specifically a strike. These 7 angels, they have the last of the strikes, which means once they're done, God's wrath is actually completed. Then we also have a quick view of what's going on with those who have overcome the beast. Now, this is different from those who are under the altar. So those during the beginning of the tribulation period who are actually killed, they're killed by the religious system that comes into power with the beast. And they are actually, we see them below the altar. These ones we see on this sea of glass. So they're a different group of people. And these ones on the sea of glass, they understand what God is doing is righteous. Remember, it also describes at this time, people are going to, saints more specifically, there's going to be relief when death comes because it's going to make them happy. It is not going to be an easy time for anybody to be here on the earth. But these are the ones who ultimately overcame the beast. They refused the mark. They would not accept it. They would not bow down to the image of the beast. And it's very clear that they lost their lives as a result of it. But they understood that what God was doing is righteous and how he's manifesting that. Now, those who are in this sea of glass here, those who are actually overcame the beast, there's not a limitation. It's like, it's not at the beginning of the second half, there's a whole bunch of people killed. It's talking about all throughout the whole second half. So we see the first bowl being poured out here, where no doubt these people would see that those who got the mark of the beast and those who worshiped his image, they have these very terrible sores upon them, sores that don't act properly and spread. And as we go on, there's some of them, no doubt, that will even see others of these bowls being poured out. So the seven angels then, with the seven strikes, are given seven bowls, and these seven bowls are then going to be described. When we're looking at that first strike is going to be those really bad sores that are going to come upon those who are of the mark, who receive the mark of the beast. Now, like I said, keep in mind as we go on with this, because it starts out as a focus on these, it's going to keep that focus unless it actually changes. So we're going to see that the majority of these are centered on those who actually accept the mark of the beast.